Everything is in place. Let's check. I hope I won't forget to click the record button. I'll be relying on my second screen here to get all the scripts.
Assalamu alaikum. In this video we'll learn how to add more security to our applications running in Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. When we use passwords or private certificates or encryption keys, we typically save those into the secret object in Kubernetes. But that object is not really a secret because at the end it's encoded using base 64. So a good solution could be either to use a private encryption key to encrypt those values and save them into the etcd in Kubernetes. But again, this means you will need to manage that private encryption key. So another solution could be to use the KMS, Key Management System, like either Azure Key Vault or HashiCorp Vault or many other solutions. Those systems, they have good features like key rotation, so that you can update your secrets frequently, and then you can also, they have features for strong encryption. Let's take a look at the different components for this workshop. So we'll be using Azure Active Directory pod identity. This will create an identity into Azure. This identity will grant access to the Azure Key Vault so that my Kubernetes cluster can access Key Vault through that identity. And then we'll use a second component, which is the secret store CSI. CSI stands for Container Storage Interface. Here we'll use this CSI for Key Vault provider. This one will mount a volume into our Kubernetes cluster, and into that volume, CSI actually will use the secret store object in order to get information about the Key Vault that we want to access, like its name, its resource group, its subscription ID, and tenant ID, along with the list of the secrets, like the passwords we want to retrieve from Key Vault. And then CSI provider will connect to Azure Key Vault, will retrieve the secrets, and then will save them locally into its disk, into a local volume, so that if my pod wants to access those secrets, he will mount that volume into that volume will be mounted to the pod, so that the pod could access those resources right from that volume. So we'll start first by setting up the environment. So we need IKS to be installed, and we'll need also to create a Key Vault resource along with an identity, and then we'll go to install Azure Active Directory pod identity and secret store CSI for Key Vault using Helm charts and YAML Kubernetes manifest. Let's get started here. So a bit of history about this project, about the CSI provider for Kubernetes. At first it was called the Kubernetes Key Vault Flexible, which is now deprecated, as you can see it right here. And this project is now replaced by the Secret Store CSI driver, which is like the interface in Kubernetes that should be implemented by each cloud provider or each provider that wants to give access to or who wants to use it. So Azure have an implementation for that library, and it's called the Secret Store CSI driver provider for Azure. And here you have it's an open source project on GitHub, so you can see here more details about this. For this workshop, we'll be using lots of PowerShell scripts, or actually we'll be using AZ command line to create resources in Azure, and they have here all those commands documented right here in this project, so you can take a look at it. And they have put all the commands actually into the commands.ps1 file. I have already downloaded that in my machine, as you can see right here. And yes, because I also need a Kubernetes cluster, so I have created one in Azure in AKS, and here it did already created. So I'll go to that resource, and here when I have so how I did create my cluster, I did go to the go to resource, then I have selected Kubernetes service, and then I have filled the information for the name, the resource group for my cluster, the region, the version for my cluster, the number of the nodes, and so on. And then make sure when you create the cluster, make sure on the authentication side you select here service principal, because this workshop will apply to a service principal. That's what the identity is using here. So let's start now by setting up the environment. So here we need to connect to our Kubernetes cluster. So for that we need its name, we need the subscription ID that we are using, we need the tenant ID, the location, and the name of the resource group, and then we'll create the key vault. So for that we need a name for our key vault instance, and because we want to enter or to add the database password and database login using the command line, so here I have created an aliases for those values right here, and then some other values that we'll be using later in this workshop. So I'll start by running this code into the command line. Here I'm using PowerShell, but you can also use Bash if you want to. So this is now connecting to my Azure subscription, and in order to retrieve the subscription ID from my default account, then it will retrieve the tenant ID, the location, and so on. And here you can see the different values that I have already specified. Good. Now let's go to get information about the AKS cluster that we have created. For that, I run this command az AKS show to retrieve my cluster using its name and its resource group, because I need here the AKS service principal later in this demo. So I'm getting that into an AKS value. And of course, because this is a new cluster, so I need to connect to that cluster using the command AKS get credentials. This will connect to my Kubernetes cluster, will get the credentials and save them into the local kubeconfig file. Then now I want to create a key vault resource in Azure. For that I'm using this command az key vault create. Then I pass the key vault name, the resource group, the location, and here I specify that I want to enable soft delete for retention for 7 days as retention days. This will enable me to retrieve my keys or my secrets even after the key vault was deleted in a 7 days period. Once that's done, here I'll move to create or to insert a first secret into my key vault resource. Here it will be called this secret, and then the value will be this value specified right here. And as you can see, then I'll insert a second secret, which will be the password for my database. So first secret is actually called the database login, and second secret is called the database password. And if I move back to the Azure portal right here, if I go to dashboard, then I move to my resource group for RGDemo09. From here I can see that I have now my AKS cluster and a key vault resource that was created. And if I go right to the secrets, I should see my two secrets, database login and database password, that were created here. Then here I go to install the CSI or the secret store CSI driver using a Helm chart. For that I need to add the repository for that Helm chart. Then I run the command helm install with the name of that specific chart in order to add it or to install it into my Kubernetes cluster. Here I'll go to install it into a new namespace. For that I have created a new namespace called CSI driver, and then I specify that namespace on the helm install command. After the install, I go to run get kubectl get pods in order to get the different pods right there. And here I see 3 pods because already on my Kubernetes cluster I have 3 nodes. So that here it will install a pod in each of one of my nodes. After that, I go to install the secret store CSI driver for Key Vault, which is the Azure implementation for CSI driver. This one is the one that will connect to Key Vault. For that, I'll use this YAML Kubernetes manifest file, which will go to install the different required pods and the different other objects. And if After that, if I run get pods into the CSI driver namespace, I can see that here it added 3 different pods. So again, a pod per node. So here the Key Vault provider will try to connect to my Key Vault resource, which is in Azure, and the Key Vault provider is in Kubernetes. So it doesn't know about my Key Vault instance. So we need to give it those different information about the subscription ID for my Azure subscription, the resource group, the name of the Key Vault itself, and the different secrets to retrieve. And we can do this here by specifying a class that is of type secret provider class. This one will provide those different information for that CSI provider. So you see here the different parameters. It tells it to use pod identity, and then the name of the Key Vault, and then the different values we want to retrieve from Key Vault. Here, those values will default to the database login and database password. And then here we pass the subscription ID, resource group, and the tenant ID. We'll go to deploy that into Kubernetes cluster using kube control create-f. Then we pass that value into the command line. After that, we'll go to install Azure Active Directory pod identity using a YAML manifest file into our AKS cluster. For that, we are using the command kube control apply-f, then the path for that YAML file. Note that here this is using the deployment.airbag.yaml file, which is meant to install pod identity into a cluster that have airbag enabled. If by any chance on your cluster you don't have airbag enabled, there is another file, just deployment.yaml, which will install it, which will take into consideration that airbag is not installed in your cluster. After installing that, so we can see here multiple objects was created to enable pod identity. And right there, if I run kube control get pods, I'll see the different objects that were added by pod identity, like here the MIC, which is the managed identity controller, and then the NMI node managed instance, which will work together in order to use the identity to get access to other Azure resources. Now we'll go to create the Azure identity itself that will be used by the CSI driver and will grant access to Key Vault. So for that, I'm using the command line az identity create, and then the resource group, the name of that identity, and so on. I can do this also from the Azure portal itself, but here I'm again using the command line for those operations. After creating the identity, I'll give it access, or I'll grant it access to the Key Vault. For that, I'm using here the AZ role assignment, where I'm passing the role as reader for the identity principal ID, and then the scope is the Key Vault.id. So this will my identity now have the read access over my Key Vault, so it can access my Key Vault. And then later I'm add another role assignment of managed identity operator for my Kubernetes cluster. For that, I'm passing here my AKS service principal profile dot client ID. After that, I have added a role or a policy. I have added a policy into my identity to have permission to read the secrets from my Key Vault. So for that, here I'm using this secret permissions get. So my Key Vault defines multiple policies like get, delete, update, and so on. And here my identity will now can access the Key Vault and can also read the secrets. So this is specific to only the secrets. If you want to access the keys or the certificates, there is you can specify the -- secret -- certificates or keys. So now from the Azure portal, if I go to the Azure portal, to the resource group, if I go to refresh here, I should see that now I have a third resource, which is the identity. If I go to that identity, And then I go to Azure Resources. I should see that here it will populate that now it have an identity to connect to the Key Vault. And if I go back to my Key Vault right here, I should see that it have a policy. So if I go to Access Policies, now I should see it's not only mine, but if I go to refresh, I should see now the policy that is coming from my identity, which have the secret permissions to do the get operations, not here the other operations that we can ask for. So now we have the identity and we want to use that identity from our Kubernetes cluster, but Kubernetes doesn't know about that identity. So here we'll be using the Azure identity and Azure identity binding in order to get a reference to that identity, and then resources from within my cluster can use those bindings in order to bind to the identity itself. So here I'll go to create two Kubernetes objects. First one is the Azure identity, which will have a name and it will bind to a resource ID and the client ID, which is here the identity itself. So this is a reference to the identity itself. And then if I want to use that identity, I should pass through the Azure identity binding object. This one will have a reference to the identity that I have already created right here. So note I'm using the same name for the Azure identity here and the name of my Azure identity. And then I'll use a selector. This selector will allow my other resources on Kubernetes to use this identity only by using this selector. So note this selector is already used to access to the identity itself. I have deployed that class so that will create the two objects right here. So now we have almost everything in place. So we have Azure Active Directory pod identity installed, the CSI provider for Key Vault is installed, and Key Vault instance have the secrets there, and the identity is configured to connect to my Key Vault. So here I'll go to deploy an Nginx pod that will use the label or the selector AID pod ID binding. So not here the selector that I have mentioned earlier. And then into that pod I'll go to mount a volume. So that volume that I'll be mounting is using the CSI, the container storage instance, and it uses the secrets store driver, and in that volume we'll use the secret provider class to retrieve the Key Vault that I want to connect to, and using that provider class to retrieve the different passwords that this pod asks for. So this means now that my Nginx pod have this CSI volume mounted to that pod, and it have the passwords there. So let's run kubectl get pods, and here we can see our Nginx pod is already running here. So now I'll go to run some commands in order to access. First command right here will list the different passwords in that secret store volume. So here we find two values for database login and database password. We'll go to read using cat. We'll read the database login, and here the login will be displayed right here. And then if we try to read the database password, as we have done here, so that will give us access to the database password. So now this pod could have access to the Key Vault, not direct access through using the password for that Key Vault, but through using pod identity and the CSI provider for Key Vault in order to use the identity and that provider to get access or to gain access to the Key Vault and then retrieve those secrets. So the secrets now will be saved or are already saved into this CSI volume. I leave you with some good resources that you can follow in order to get more details about this CSI project or the CSI provider for Key Vault. So here, if you go to projects, you will see their roadmap explained right here. So you can see the upcoming features and the new features that will be released zone. And I don't want also to miss the opportunity to invite you to check out my YouTube channel, where I have added videos about anything that is containers, Kubernetes, DevOps, and Azure. I hope you will like it, and see you in my next videos.